I remember when I was in 1993, I was in second grade in Southwest Ohio, and that was the time that I first heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech for the first time. That was the speech where he said, I hope my 4 children grow up in a country where they are judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And I'll tell you, that dream, it stuck with me. It meant something to me because it was the dream that allowed me to go in a single generation from being the kid of Indian immigrants who came to this country with almost no money to becoming the founder of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. I led that company as CEO for 7 years until this January when I stepped down to work on a different kind of cancer, not a biological cancer, but a cultural cancer that threatened to kill that dream that Martin Luther King had 60 years ago, a cancer that threatened to kill the very dream that allowed me to achieve everything I ever had in my career. And they teach in medical school, they teach in medicine, they teach in science, that in order to understand a cancer deeply, you first have to understand its root causes. And so let me talk about the root causes of this cancer before I talk about it first. The root causes of this cancer begin not in 21st century America, but in 20th century Europe, with the 2 most toxic ideologies of the last century. In my opinion, German Marxism, German Nazism, which was effectively identity politics on steroids, and Soviet Marxism, which was effectively an oppressor-oppressed narrative on steroids. You merge the 2, and you get their love child, wokeism on modern American soil. Wokeism is a new secular religion in this country whose belief system centers on the idea that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation, full stop. It says that America is a systemically racist country, that if you're black, you're inherently disadvantaged, that if you're white, you're inherently privileged. No matter your economic background or your upbringing, your race and your gender govern who you are and the thoughts and ideas you're allowed to have. And you don't have to take it from me. You could take it directly from the high priests of this new religion. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, one of those high priests, famously said it a year and a half ago when she remarked that we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. Now, I'll put aside that I probably don't fit her description of what counts as a brown voice. The essential move in that claim is to conflate your race with something other than your skin color to also constitute your voice. And what does that mean? It means that any disagreement with that voice, with that perspective, then automatically defines you as a racist, and there is no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. So when given the choice between pledging fealty to this new religion or being tarred with that scarlet R, everyday Americans are choosing to bend the knee. And that has created a new culture of fear in our country. Fear of losing your job, fear of your kids getting a bad grade in school, fear of becoming a pariah in your own community, forcing everyday Americans to have to choose between expressing their opinions and putting food on the dinner table, between the American dream and the First Amendment, a choice that this country does not force you to make. Because in my opinion, the best measure of the health of any democracy, especially American democracy, is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. And there is no doubt that we are doing abysmally on that metric right now. So the question I'd like to turn to, building on Justin's talk that he just gave, is the question of how this system that was about challenging an orthodoxy, wokeism when it was born, went from being about challenging the system to becoming the system. And the answer to that story actually traces back to the 2008 financial crisis. I lived the '08 crisis. I got my first job out of college in the fall of 2007 at a hedge fund in New York City that earned an honorable mention in Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short. I lived in New York City. I watched this play out. And what happened was, after the '08 financial crisis, big business in this country was actually part of the bad guys. If you were on the old left, the thing you wanted to do was to take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and redistribute it to poor people to help poor people. Agree or not, that is what the old left had to say. But right around 2008, there was the birth of this new woke strand of the left that had something different to say. They said that actually the real problem wasn't quite economic injustice. It wasn't quite poverty, no. It was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And that actually presented the opportunity of a generation for big business in this country. Because if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street is a pretty tough pill to swallow. But this new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion. put some token minorities on your boards, muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly to Davos in a private jet. This is a pretty good life. I've seen it firsthand myself. They were happy to lend not just their money, but as you heard from Justin, their legitimacy to this new woke movement, but they did not do it for free. It came with an implicit ask in return, which was that the new Democratic Party in this country look the other way when it came to leaving their corporate power intact. And so that's a story I tell in my book, story of how a bunch of big banks got in bed with a bunch of woke millennials. Together they birthed woke capitalism and used that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. But that worked so well for Wall Street that Silicon Valley actually got in on the act and realized they could use that to their benefit too, because the old threat to Silicon Valley's monopoly power used to come from the left. But what they realized is if we can use our monopoly power in service of that new left to censor, or as they would say, moderate content online that certain people don't want to see on the internet, we're going to go ahead and do that. But again, we don't do it for free. We now expect that the new Democratic Party looks the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact. You see, that is how this new arranged marriage works. It is not a marriage of love. It is more like mutual prostitution, and the net result of that act is the illegitimate birth of what I call the woke industrial complex, a new Leviathan that is far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago, far more powerful than what our founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago, and that is how you get to a year in which Coca-Cola would rather make statements about a new voting law in Georgia that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, or teach its employees how to be less white, than it would talk about the impact of its own products on a nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity, by the way, in the black community that they profess to care so much about. Or if you're Nike, who Justin talked about, you'd rather criticize slavery 250 years ago in the United States by pulling the Betsy Ross flag sneaker, while doing nothing to reduce your reliance on slave labor today to get $250 sneakers from China that you sell to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. That is how this new game is played. And I have a piece of bad news for you, which is that in recent years, there's a new actor that showed up on the scene and turned this unholy alliance into a three-party affair. And that is the Communist Party of China. You see, they understand this game actually far more deeply than any of us do. There's even a Chinese word for wokeness, baizuo, literally refers to woke white people in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us, but even worse, they are using it to undermine our moral standing on the global stage by creating a false moral equivalence between the United States and China, by creating a new class of international moral arbiters, the people who are always known to criticize injustice, who never criticize injustice abroad. Have any doubt about that? Just listen carefully to what they are saying. Xi Jinping, last year, pressed by the EU on the human rights atrocities in the Xinjiang province of China, and the first thing that comes out of his mouth is the fact that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. Top diplomat Yang Jiechi comes here to the Alaska summit earlier this year, says that he wants to see the United States do better on human rights and to stop slaughtering, that is his word, slaughtering black Americans. 2 weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, Xi Jinping talking about, according to his Chinese translator, equity and inclusion more than he was talking about human rights crises in China. They are playing that game, but they're only able to get away with it in a way that would otherwise be laughable because of the actions of woke corporations here at home. Disney, 2 years ago, says it cannot shoot a film in the state of Georgia if Georgia passes the equivalent of a heartbeat bill, a new anti-abortion statute. Yet just last year goes to the Xinjiang province of China, literally ground zero of the Uyghur human rights crisis, with over 1 million Uyghurs enslaved in concentration camps, subject to communist indoctrination and worse. And they film Mulan there without saying a peep, until the very end of the film, where they finally muster up the courage to thank the local CCP authorities for allowing them the privilege of filming there. The NBA, LeBron James, Nike, the list goes on, BlackRock, Marriott, NBA. This is a growing list of companies and organizations in the United States that have created a false moral equivalence between the actions of the United States and China in a way that undermines our greatest geopolitical asset of all, and that is not our nuclear arsenal, it is our moral standing on the global stage. Thank you. Justin introduced the term stakeholder capitalism. The root philosophy of stakeholder capitalism actually originates to a philosophy that governed U.S. public policy towards China over the course of the 1990s called democratic capitalism. And the mistake we made in the 90s, and I do think it was a mistake, was to think that we could use capitalism as a vector to spread democracy, that we could export Big Macs and Happy Meals and somehow that was going to spread democracy to places like China. We thought we could use our money to get them to be more like us. Well, guess what? They have turned that game on its head. They have realized that they can use their money to get us to be more like them. Or one step worse, that they can use our money to get us to be more like them. They have sent back Disney movies and Nike sneakers as Trojan horses that undermine the United States from within. And if you have any doubt about it, just look at the way they're using that same tactic to deflect accountability for the origin of this pandemic by equating any inquiry into the origin of this pandemic with the equivalent of a racist presupposition. So who wins this game? Let's keep score. Woke corporations win. Woke activists win. The Chinese Communist Party wins. The real losers of this game are the American people and American democracy itself. Now, I'm going to save some of the discussion of the solutions for our panel, which is going to begin shortly. I would put them into three categories. Policy solutions that require a conservative movement to wake up to the fact that it is not 1980 anymore. That in 1980, the biggest threat to liberty and prosperity in this country may have been big government. It isn't today. It is a new marriage of big government and big business that is far more powerful than either one alone. It's not just big tech. It is big tech working in concert with the government, the party in power, to be able to censor content that the government could not censor directly. I say we need to wake up to the fact that state action in disguise is still state action. If it's state action in disguise, then the Constitution applies. Big tech companies ought to be bound by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States when they are doing the bidding of the state in return. If those same companies then want to go to the offline world, as you heard from Justin, and fire an employee for expressing the wrong political viewpoint or wearing the wrong candidate's hat to work, as so many did last year, then I say that if you can't fire somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Jewish or whatever, then you should not be able to fire somebody just because they're an outspoken conservative or an outspoken liberal for that matter either. We need to add political belief as a civil right to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right up there next to race, gender, religion, and national origin. So these are the kinds of policy solutions we need. Policy is still the tip of the spear. Ultimately, we need to go upstream to our schools, reviving civic education that dilutes this woke agenda to irrelevance. If we have not taught our children why America is lovable, there's no way they can love America in the end. And so I think that's a conversation that we need to have in our culture that begins with teaching not what we don't want to teach in our schools, but what we do want to teach by way of a civic education that dilutes this woke agenda to irrelevance, something that I'm happy to talk about, which goes hand in hand with the counter movement we need to see in corporate America. But most of all, I think we need to see a change that begins in our culture. And I think that change in our culture can be driven through a counter-response in corporate America itself. One of the things I have struggled with is not wanting to see the emergence of two economies, a left-wing mainstream economy, but the emergence of an alt economy on the right, a Black Rifle to a Starbucks. What would come next, a right-wing version of baseball or the NBA? If so, we may be on a path to a civil war, because if we cannot be brought together by an apolitical private sector, then we, I think, have no hope of living together in a divided polity. But I will say this. I think the next step may entail creating alternatives for 75 to 80 million people who are disaffected from their economy, which is a proxy for their culture, who need to be included. The very people who are excluded in the name of inclusion may need to be included as table stakes for beginning to move forward as a country. And I will say that in closing, we have come off of a decade of celebrating our diversity and our differences, that we have actually forgotten all of the ways in which we are the same as one people. And make no mistake, our diversity is a beautiful thing. But in my mind, it is meaningless if there is nothing greater that binds us together across that diversity, or else we're nothing more than a group of higher mammals roaming a common geographic space, doing what our iPhones told us to do on a given day. That is not America. America is a vision of what a place can be. It is not a place, and it is at the top of that vision, and I'll close with this, at the top of that vision was the dream I told you about at the very beginning, the American dream. The idea that no matter who you are or where your parents came from or what your skin color is, that you can achieve anything you ever want in this country with your own hard work, your own commitment, and your own dedication. That is the American dream, and that is what we will need to revive in order to defeat this cultural epidemic. Thanks, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.